So welcome to those of you at mochurch.tv. Welcome to those of you in person. If you want to, you can download the Bible app for free. We're going to go to Mark chapter 15, and I'll be using the NIV, New International Version. So I was 24 years old, and I was starting my first full-time ministry, vocational ministry job as an associate minister at a church called New Life in the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. And I'd preached a couple of random miscellaneous Sundays that our lead minister let me preach. And being 23 years old, this is my first time getting to do a lot of preaching. And so he gave me a 4-week series. And he said, here, you get a whole week, a whole 4-week series that you can preach on. So to those of you who know me or have been around for Momentum for a while, it won't shock you that my topic for that 4-week series, it was something called the Zombie series. And in October, I like to preach on, like classic monsters or whatever, and pull some point where people are kind of like, where is this going? And then tie it into Scripture. And so I did this 4-week series called the Zombie series. And so I preached week 1 of the Zombie series, my first sermon series ever, 23 years old. And I walked out of the amphitheater or of the middle school. We met in a public middle school as a portable church. I walked out of that amphitheater, and a lady named Nanette came up to me. I'm not hiding names. We're just putting them out there. A lady named Nanette came up to me, and she was visibly shaking. And she walked up to me, she said, "Can I talk to you?" And I was like, "Yeah, is everything okay? Like, do I need to check your pulse? Like, what's going on?" And so we sat down at a bench right in the main lobby as people were coming and going from the worship services. And she sat down and she said, "That sermon that you just preached was from the devil." And I went, "From the Prince of Darkness himself?" Now, I kind of was a smart aleck 23-year-old. I have totally exterminated all that from my personality. Not a smart aleck at all now. But I was like, "What? It's from the devil?" And she was like, "Yes, you took voodooism from Haiti and compared it to the Christian faith." And she's shaking. She's like, "You can't take something evil and bad and compare it to the Lord's faith." And was like, I was like, well, wait a minute. I was like, I think you can because Jesus did. I was like, there's often negative, bad images in the Bible where creatively a teacher like Jesus or St. Paul would pull that image and say, now there's an aspect of this that's true. I said, for instance, Jesus said, "When I return, the second coming of Christ, I will come like a thief in the night." I said, thief, bad. Jesus returning unexpectedly, good. She didn't like that. And so the funny thing is the whole time this is going on, and we're having this incredibly insulting conversation about how my sermon was from the devil. And I mean, it was all about Jesus and all this cool stuff. So it wasn't like it was freaky stuff going on in my sermon. The whole time, like, she's shaking, talking to me about my sermon, and people are walking by. "Hey, great sermon, Dan. Thank you very much. Thank you." So it was like the most insulting and affirming moment constantly going on. Finally, I just said, "Nanette, I want to give you a chance to calm down, and maybe I could come over to your house sometime this week and talk to you, your husband, Rick, and just sit down and talk this out for a minute." She said, "Okay." And she walked down the left, just shaking or whatever. I was like, man, this is legit. I'm 23. I don't know how to do adulting like this. What is going on? So I went to her and Rick's house, and this wasn't the first weird kind of little run-in that I'd had with them, really awkward exchanges. So I sat down at their house in their living room, and I just said, "Guys, I just want to say, I know I've only been here a couple of months, but I feel like we've really gotten off on the wrong foot, and I don't know what's happened. So whatever I have done or said to offend you or make you mad, obviously we've started off on the wrong foot. I just want to apologize." And Nanette looked at me and she said, "It isn't anything that you've done or said. It's just who you are." I was like, wow, this is brutal. The blows just keep coming. And so it was a really great start. There was a couple more insulting things that happened in that conversation, but it was a really great start for ministry and leadership and all that for me. And I know some of you have jobs also and lives where that's the case. It's not like it's just in leadership, but it was a great start for a 23-year-old Dan Smith to just be like, man, this is going to kind of set the tone for learning to deal with criticism and being insulted and trying to respond graciously and less sarcastically and all these different things. And so I just really started thinking about that. And one of the lessons that I learned from this in general was like, man, okay, so I've got a life of as a minister, a pastor, a leader, a Browns fan, of being insulted by many different people. And so I was like, there's a lot of that. But here's one of the insights that I've kind of thought about over the years, and that is sometimes it's really easy when someone is criticizing you, insulting you, or critiquing you to be like, yeah, but look at that person. They don't have their lives together. They're a train wreck as a parent. Or, you can come up with something in your mind to justify that I don't need to accept this critique from them. For Nanette, she's had fun one time in her life. She's like the most serious person in the world. She remembers a time back in 6th grade. I remember that time I had fun. I just wanted to do that in my mind. But I eventually kind of learned, and it wasn't necessarily that month, but I learned it. I want to say, well, look at the source. But sometimes, even if the source isn't impressive or credible, you have to ask the question to be a self-aware person. But is what they're saying, even though it's insulting, is it true? And you have to evaluate, and sometimes you may say, and with the counsel of some of your friends, is this true of me? Is this true of me? You have to ask, is this true? And sometimes the answer will be, no, I think it was just that person, or we don't gel. Other times you might be like, even though that source is a weird source, I think there is some truth in what they've said, and you have to evaluate to be a self-aware person. So this morning, I kind of want to harken back to the lobby moment where there was all this insulting stuff going on, and at the same time affirming, that was a really cool, interesting sermon, very inductive. I didn't know where you're going, but man, good points. And you're all that going on. In the meantime, there's the devil, all that kind of stuff, head spinning, puking pea soup, that kind of stuff. Incredibly affirming and incredibly insulting at the same time. And I just thought, I think it'd be good for us to talk about something today that is incredibly affirming, but is also incredibly insulting. And it has to do with all of us. Excited? So we're going to take a look at Mark chapter 15. In Mark chapter 15, we're kind of on just a little on-ramp to Easter. We usually do series that are a few weeks long or whatever, but I got sick for a couple weeks, and so I had to kind of scrap the series that had to be 4 weeks long that I was going to do. And so I was like, all right, we're just going to go to the end of the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to look at Mark chapter 15 and look at the cross this week. And next week, we're going to look at another thing from Mark chapter 15 with the cross. And then on Easter, we're going to look at the resurrection in Mark chapter 16. And so I've been on this mission the last few years to really try to understand the cross more. And that's the main thing I want to do this morning, is to maybe help you understand more of what the cross is. What does that mean? I've had many times in my life where I've looked at the cross and heard the message of stuff about Jesus dying on the cross and thought, what does that mean? What does that have to do with me? How does it even affect me in my life? I don't know. And so I've had to kind of learn that. And especially over the last couple years, I've just been digging deeper to understand different things about the cross. And so hopefully this morning you'll have a little bit more of an understanding of what is that all about? Mark chapter 15 says this, verse 15. Pilate, the Roman governor that Jesus stood before, had Jesus flogged. He had him beaten and handed him over to be crucified. Verse 22, they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. I know I should have all this memorized. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, sarcastically by the way, the King of the Jews. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, looking at what you call a gospel account, an account of the life of teachings of Jesus, gospel means good news. The gospel account of Mark here that we're reading, there's 2 epic understatements in this gospel account that we've just read. The first epic understatement is when he says Pilate had Jesus flogged. Just an epic understatement when you understand what Romans did to people when they flogged them. And so my wife Shannon, she's a PK, she's a pastor's kid. She's also a PW, pastor's wife. And we watch shows. Usually we watch a show before we go to bed at night and something just kind of wind down and chill and just like after a day of, being exhausted, working and all that. We watch a show together. And the one thing that Shannon really will leave the room for on the shows that we pick to watch or whatever is there's one thing that she's just like, oh man, I can't do that. To kind of set this up, she's never seen Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ. And you might be like, I thought she was a Christian. But for her, the thing that she can't stomach is seeing someone tortured. She's like, I just can't do it. So we were watching Madam Secretary, which we finished a couple months ago. And anytime there was some military thing where there might be a questioning, she's like, I'll be in the kitchen. Just let me know if they start pulling fingernails off or so. I can't be in here for that. I can't stomach torture. A couple weeks ago, my friend Vern Blaze texted me about how much he loves the series, The Chosen, that's out. And he said, man, I love that series. I could watch every episode of every season of that series. Then he put parenthetically in his text, except for maybe the crucifixion, because I don't like torture scenes. So many of you relate to that, just like, gosh, that's the last thing I want to see, watching Lost, the old series, or whatever. I don't want to see any torture scenes going down, anything like that. And so I'm inviting Vern over to watch the Saw horror series next week. No. But with that said, I just want to spend a brief moment describing what would have happened in a Roman flogging. In March 1965, there was a physician named Dr. C. Truman Davis who wrote, you could call it like a historical medical analysis, and the article is called The Crucifixion of Jesus, and it was written for Arizona Medicine. And this is how Dr. C. Truman Davis briefly describes Jesus' flogging. He says, the heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders, back, and legs. At first, the heavy strips of leather cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, the tissues under the skin, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. Now, when I started going to church, I didn't go to church until I was in high school. My youth minister, I remember describing the floggings that the Romans would give people, and I remember him just saying, at the end of the flogging that Pilate ordered for Jesus, his back would have looked like raw hamburger. And historically, Romans often beat people so badly, you could start to visibly see some of their organs from behind. And so it was an awful, awful thing. In fact, it was so bad, most people died before they ever got to crucifixion. They died in the floggings. Rarely did someone survive. So that's one of the epic understatements in Mark's account. The second epic understatement in Mark's account is this: they crucified him. That is an epic understatement. I mean, leaving out anything that might describe what is Roman crucifixion, which they stole from the Persians. What is that? And so this is how Dr. C. Truman Davis describes what happened during the 6-hour crucifixion. And I think this is probably the best description that I've ever heard written based on the different pieces of things that I've learned about Roman crucifixion. And then we'll move on. Okay? I know. So here it is. He says this: the patibellum, which is the horizontal wooden beam of the cross, is placed on the ground, and Jesus is quickly thrown backwards with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depression at the front of the wrist. He drives a heavy, square, wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly, he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. The patibellum is then lifted in place at the top of the stipe, the vertical beam. The left foot is pressed on top of the right foot with both feet extended, toes down. One nail is driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim is now crucified. As he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails and the wrists, excruciating, fiery pain shoots through his fingers and up his arms to explode in the brain. The nails and the wrists are putting pressure on the median nerves. As he pushes himself upward to avoid the stretching torment, he places his full weight on the nail through his feet Again, there is a searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, another phenomenon occurs. As the arms fatigue, great waves of cramps sweep over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. Air can be drawn into the lungs, but cannot be exhaled. Jesus fights to raise himself in order to get even one small breath. Finally, carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he's able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in life-giving oxygen. Hours of this limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rending cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain as tissue is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. Then agony begins, a deep crushing pain in the chest as the pericardium slowly fills with serum and begins to compress the heart. It is now almost over. The loss of tissue fluids has reached a critical level. The compressed heart is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissues. The tortured lungs are making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. The body of Jesus is now in extremis, which is Latin for near death. And he can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. His mission of atonement, or substitutionary death, has been completed. Finally, he can allow his body to die. Now, that is one of the most articulate, accurate from what I've read in many different sources and bits and pieces of what crucifixion by the Romans looked like back in that era in ancient history. So why these two epic understatements? Why does Mark, the author, keep it so simple? He just says they crucified him. And most of you are like, thank you. I can picture that a little bit, but all the gory details are left out. Why? Well, here's why. Because physical suffering is not the focus of the cross. And for that reason, we're moving on because it's not the focus of the sermon either. It's not Mark's focus about the gospel, the good news message of Jesus. Notice that later in the account, notice when Jesus cries out on the cross, he doesn't cry out, my friends who have all abandoned him and left him. He doesn't cry out, my hands. He doesn't cry out, my head from the crown of thorns, or my feet, or my side from a spear that's jabbed in his side. He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's what he cries out. It says at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, forsaken, as many of you know, just means to quit. It means to leave. It means to desert or abandon. So Jesus is saying, God, why are you leaving me? Father in heaven, why are you abandoning me? Why are you leaving me? He's losing the Father. That's what's happening in this moment on the cross. So it wasn't just the physical pain or the emotional pain. Every kind of human evil you can just about think of was thrown at Jesus. But it isn't the physical pain or the emotional pain that Jesus experienced on the cross that's the focus. As horrible as that torture it would have been, and being beaten in the crown of thorns and all that, nails through hands and feet, he doesn't say anything about that on the cross. Like it really stands out that there's no statements about the pain on the cross that comes from the physical torture. In fact, as I was studying this the last couple of weeks, reading like different Bible scholars and commentaries, about this account, a couple of the quotes really stood out to me. The kinds of things they would say about the statement, my God, why have you forsaken? Why have you left me, abandoned me? This is what some of them said. There's a scholar named William Barclay says, there is a mystery behind that cry which we cannot penetrate. Another, Walter W. Wessel, said, the meaning of the cry of agony lies beyond human comprehension. And then one more, a guy named Vincent Taylor says, the depths of the saying are too deep to be plumbed or probed. And so you might be like, I don't get it. And I'm with you, just stay with me. They're saying, we can't even comprehend what's going on at the moment when Jesus cries, my God, Why have you forsaken? But it's language of intimacy. That's what the language is that Jesus is using here. For instance, if I were after the service to kind of walk out toward the lobby, and one of you came up to me visibly shaking, and you said, Dan, that was awful. That sermon was from the devil. And I'd be like, man, I've been there, But if you said to me, because of that, I don't ever want to see you or talk to you again, I'm leaving, I'm gone. That would hurt. That would hurt. I've definitely had good friends at Momentum who have moved away or left Momentum for whatever reason. And, people who have been mad at me, at times in the past, whether in church or out of church. Like, that would hurt a lot. But if I walked out of this auditorium afterward and my wife came up to me and said, I don't ever want to see you or talk to you again, the pain is infinitely more. Because psychologists will tell you one of the worst things you could possibly ever experience, to lose a spouse through death or divorce even, is one of the most traumatic things that could ever happen to a human being. If you've been there, there's some validation there of like, it was just a divorce, it wasn't a death. No, that's one of the most traumatic things that can ever happen to a human being. Why? Because the longer the love, the deeper the love, the greater the torment of the loss. It's one thing for a friend that you've known for a couple years to say, I don't ever see you, talk to you again. But someone you've been married to. And so when you look at the cross, look, this is God the Father, God the Son. They've been in unity and in community with each other for all eternity, is what Scripture teaches us. And so the greatest love between two human beings that could ever have in the history of the world is nothing compared to the relationship of God the Father, God the Son. It's infinitely long. It's infinitely perfect. Jesus is losing that in this moment on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he's not saying anything about my hands, my feet, my side, my head, my friends, my friend. He's not saying anything like that. There's a poem named Elizabeth Browning who has a poem called Cowper's Grave, and it's about Jesus and the crucifixion and all that. And she has one phrase in it that I just think is so powerful, where she describes Jesus' cry that we're talking about from the cross, Emmanuel's orphaned cry. It's like, man, that is a heavy phrase, because Emmanuel is a name or a title, really, that we use at Christmas time. It means God with us. Like, how mind-blowing that God entered our world, as a finite baby. That's Emmanuel, God with us. And so this is Emmanuel, the Son of God, basically saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Father, I can't feel your hand anymore. That's the cry. It's this cry of intimacy of what is happening in the cross, what's happening, and we can't dodge the reality of Jesus's forsakenness. Like, this is an expression of Jesus being abandoned by the Father. And so it can't be overemphasized or overstated when you talk about the cross. This is one thing that just, it's hard to grasp, but instead of coming into the world to inflict the horrors of the darkest wrath upon rebellious humans, God absorbs them himself. Like, really, if you weren't familiar in any way with the Christian message, you might say, I'm familiar very little with it. But you have some maybe concept of Jesus died on the cross. People say he's the Son of God and all that kind of stuff. But if you were to write the story or guess what the story would be, that God would come to the earth as a human, you would be like, oh man, this is not going to go well. Like, just read the news, how we treat each other, what's going on. Oh, it's about to be on like Donkey Kong. And so God shows up, and you would expect him to be cracking a whip, swinging a rod, going nuts on people. But instead, he absorbs that himself. Whatever wrath should be poured out on rebellious humankind, he comes and he takes it himself. So what does that mean? What does the cross mean? What's coming down on Jesus in these moments on the cross? Here's what it means. Jesus is getting our judgment day. He's receiving our judgment day. The rod of God's wrath is coming down on him. He is being engulfed in eternal darkness. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, three of the gospel writers, what they call the synoptic writers, they all go out of their way to say that darkness came across the land during the crucifixion 3 hours into it out of the 6. So the last 3 hours of the crucifixion, there was a darkness. And people have tried to say, well, there's probably an eclipse that happened at that time. Well, an eclipse of the sun, that lasts a few moments. And it's Passover time for the Jews when Jesus was crucified. So that means there's a full moon, which means it's impossible for there to be a solar eclipse. So this is a supernatural darkness that lasts for 3 hours. And what that is symbolizing is God's displeasure, God's wrath being poured out, his judgment, but it's on Jesus. He's experiencing our judgment day. And this is astounding. On the cross, Jesus is tasting separation from God. And if you've been around church any amount of time or a student of Scripture at all, you might see that as a catchphrase. What is separation from God? Jesus is experiencing separation from God. Well, separation from God, the very essence of that, the definition of that is hell. That's what hell is. It's not so much a place as it is a state. Hell is separation from God. And that's what's happening to Jesus here. Jesus, as hard as this is to comprehend, is in hell on the cross. He's experiencing separation from God. My God, why have you left me? Why have you forsaken me? And so no one on earth has ever suffered like this man has suffered. No one. Sometimes people ask me really good, thoughtful questions about Scripture, the Bible, and there'll be times where I'll be like, oh yeah, that's one I've thought of many times, one I've answered many times. Other times I'll be like, man, that's good. I might need to think about that, do some research on it, ask some friends, whatever. And so one of the ones that I'll commonly get is sometimes people will ask, because I don't preach about hell every week, sometimes people ask me like, do you think that there's literal fire in hell, or do you think that's just a metaphor? And I'll be like, well, no, I don't think it's literal hell. I do think that is a metaphor. And you'll see often them breathe a sigh of relief. And I'll be like, well, but whatever the metaphor is, it's for something, it represents something infinitely worse than fire. And they're like, oh, sorry, I know. But, these images in Scripture of the darkness, the fire, where the worm doesn't die, those things are just trying to express something to us that humans couldn't even comprehend with metaphors and images. And here's the deal. As much as that sounds like such a downer and a bummer in the 21st century, if you don't believe or understand the doctrine of hell, you will never understand how much God truly loves you. I mean, it's remarkable how that actually becomes something that helps you understand the love of God and what Jesus went through, how much he values you. Why does Jesus speak about hell more than anyone else combined in the entire Bible? Why? Because on the cross, he took it. He was separated from the Father for our sakes, and he's in hell, and the metaphorical fire was poured down into his heart. He took that for us. And so until you understand or believe in hell, you'll never know how much Jesus cares. And on the cross, Jesus experienced the ultimate isolation, separation that we deserve, and he took it on himself. There's a Christian theologian, Christian church theologian named Jack Cottrell, who says that there are two reasons that we can't even fathom the spiritual agony that Christ went through us on the cross. It's just infinite, unimaginable for two reasons. One is because Jesus was sinless. So try to even picture this of like Jesus' soul was pure, unscarred, unhardened by sin, yet he was facing the penalty for the sins in the history of the world. 2 Corinthians 5 says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. And so just try to get your mind around, because of the sinlessness of Jesus, the agony of having all of the sins poured on you, in you. And then the other reason it's unfathomable is because Jesus was God. And so we talk about being the living God. Well, both of those words, living and God, he's experiencing the antithesis to both of those words. He's the living God in the flesh, and the living God is experiencing death, the antithesis of living and God. He's facing death itself. So Jack Cottrell's like, man, this suffering was infinite, is unimaginable agony. It had to be. It can't be quantified. And one of the things that he says that I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about, trying to comprehend it, and at first I was like, I don't know about that. And I just kept thinking about it, reading it. He says, the finite suffering of an infinite being would have to be equal or equivalent to the infinite suffering of finite beings. What he's saying is this is the equivalent of an eternity in hell, what Jesus has experienced on the cross. And I remember reading that like, no, that doesn't make any sense. And they're just like, man, I'm trying to grasp that. I'm just like trying to go with them here of like, man, philosophically, that's hard to get my mind around. One direct quote, he says, if Christ actually took our place in bearing the wrath of God, this means that he bore the full force of God's wrath. He suffered the equivalent of eternity in hell for every sinner. And that's the reason why the atonement or the substitutionary death, the substitutionary payment for sin, that's why it couldn't be accomplished by any other being or creature or angel or man. The atonement had to be accomplished by God himself to pay the price as an infinite being with finite suffering the cross to experience an eternity of hell for us. Now, on the flip side of that, the one thing that the cross also represents, I just spent a moment on this, is no one, as much as Jesus suffered, not only has no one ever suffered like this, but also no one has ever obeyed God like this. I mean, really think about that. He trusted the Father all the way to the cross. He got to the Garden of Gethsemane right before the cross, and he essentially said, God, if there's any other way to do this, Father, if this can be taken from me, can we accomplish this in some other way? But no matter what, your will be done. I'll do what you want to. He obeyed him. He didn't back out. He obeyed the Father all the way to the cross. He trusted the Father even to the point of being damned. And that's never happened before, and it'll never happen again. I mean, that's Jesus. No one has ever obeyed God like that. No one has ever been faithful like that. So why? Why is he enduring infinite suffering? Why is he accomplishing infinite obedience? Why? And the maybe obvious answer is for you, for me, for us. And so this is something I want to make clear about the cross. And I want to make clear in my preaching over and over again. I kind of hope this is one of those things you're like, Dan keeps saying this. Maybe from here on out, like, man, does he have any new material? No, it's just this important that I want to underscore how important this is. This is the gospel, the good news of Jesus, what the whole Bible is all about. In the Old Testament pointing to, in the New Testament pointing back to. It's central. It's everything. It is the crux. It's all of it. And that is this. The gospel message, the message of the cross, has two parts. The first is this. The first, it's incredibly insulting, the message of the cross is. This is what it's saying. You and I, we're so wicked and spiritually lost that the only thing that could save us was that the Son of God had to show up on earth and die for us. I mean, honestly, when you think about that, that's an incredibly insulting message. That's like me shaking, telling you right now, like, I got something I got to tell you. This is an incredibly insulting message. So I have to channel my internet to deliver it to you, okay? And so in this case, you have to ask the tough question, though, and that is, okay, it's insulting, but is it true? And I just want to challenge you. It might be a first spiritual step for some of you to say, if I really examine the dark side of my heart, what I'm capable of, my thoughts, my motives, my actions, my past, all that stuff, I have lived a life that has been, I've got some things that I can brag about, but the truth is I've been so self-centered. I've been so selfish. I'm in so much denial about things that I've done that were selfish. I'm that broken and lost and sinful and rebellious thinking that I know better than God. He created me, therefore he owns me. I owe my life to him because I am his creation. But I've said, I'll do it my way. And that's the truth about us, is that we're so bad that only the death of the Son of God could save us. So to believe in the cross, it's incredibly insulting. And that's kind of a first step, is, man, that's an unbelievably difficult message. And it takes great humility to eventually receive it. That's why maybe the number one virtue that Jesus preaches about over and over is pride versus humility. Like it takes so much humility to receive the message of Jesus. But on the flip side of that, because it's a two-part message, what the cross is about, what the gospel is about. On the other side of that, it's amazingly affirming. I mean, when you think about this, the cross it's incredibly insulting because, this is all that's happened, how sinful we are, but it's amazingly affirming because you're so valuable and loved is what it says, that Jesus was glad to do this for you. That's the gospel. Like, we're so loved and valuable to our Creator, loved by our Creator, that Jesus was glad to go to the cross and endure that torture, that punishment, that separation, hell, receive our judgment, all that stuff. The cross says he loves you so much that he was willing to go to this depth rather than lose you. That's what he thinks about you. That's what he thinks. That's how loved you are, accepted, valued you are. So the cross, it's the most affirming message in the world. This is what your Creator thinks about you. He cares for you at infinite cost to himself. That's what love looks like in any relationship. They will do something for me at a cost to themselves. He cares for you an infinite cost to himself. In fact, there's this great verse in Hebrews 12:2 that says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. What does that mean? It means Jesus, for instance, in Gethsemane, can look in his foresight at what is about to happen. He knows what's coming. He says, Father, please take this from me. Can we do it in another way? He looks forward at the torture, the bloodiness, the gore of the cross, and he says, I don't want to do that, but I will do that because I see through the cross to the other side, and on the other side of the cross is joy. What joy? Joy for you that you could receive salvation and be like, man, I know I'm broken. I know I've messed up, but I can receive salvation and be saved from God from all my rebellion. And he looks through the cross and he sees the joy that he will have, knowing that he has brought you into his spiritual family, that you can be adopted into God's spiritual family. And that's because of his crazy affection for you, that it also is joy for him. So for the joy set before him, he endured that. He was glad to do it because of the joy set before him. So the first message out of those two, it tells Dan Smith, you're a sinner. The second one says, Dan Smith, you are a loved sinner. That's incredibly powerful. The first message humbles you. The second one encourages you and emboldens you and energizes you and says, man, if I really grasp this, I will tell the world this is what God is like and what he thinks about me and what he thinks about us. Martin Lloyd-Jones was a Welsh minister, Protestant minister, but he was also a medical doctor, which means he was really smart because he was a minister. No, I'm just kidding. And so he's really, really smart dude, but Martin Lloyd-Jones, he was one of the great preachers of the 20th century, but he imagine like, for instance, you got a dog and you're leaving town and you need a friend to come over and feed your dog, give it water, let it out, go to the bathroom. And so your friend comes over, but when you come back from your trip, your friend says to you really awkwardly, hey, everything went great with the dog, but I do have something to confess to you. While you were gone, I fed the dog and was playing with the dog for a minute, and I saw some bills on the table that were opened, and I have to admit that I looked at one of the bills, and I snooped. He said, I opened the bill and I looked at it and I saw the bill. And I just felt this overwhelming, compelling feeling that I wanted to pay that bill for you. And so I paid the bill for you. And this preacher, Lloyd-Jones, says, how do I respond to that? Like, what a snoop. He was digging through my stuff. Like, he actually pulled it out of the envelope, But he said the truth is, I wouldn't know how to respond to that until I knew how much the bill was. Right? So was it postage due? Was it, this is a letter from the IRS for 10 years of back taxes? Was it, this is a medical bill from a time where we didn't have insurance to cover stuff? Like, what bill was it? Because the answer to the question of how big was the bill that you paid for me, that shows what my response will be. You'll either get a handshake or a thank you, or I might fall down at your feet and kiss your feet and be like, oh my gosh, you did that for me? And so it all depends on how big was the bill that was paid. And I'm just saying, when you allow yourself to see and to grasp Jesus losing the infinite love of the Father out of his infinite love for you, man, it'll melt the hardness of your heart. It'll open your eyes and shatter your darkness. It'll make you look at things that maybe for months, for years, maybe you've come to momentum saying, I'd love to follow Jesus, but man, I like sex. Man, I'd love to follow Jesus, but man, I love these goals that are really just about my ego. Man, I love Jesus, but blah, blah, blah. It'll make you look at that stuff and be like, are you kidding me? This is the one thing that I've been searching for all of my life. This is the one thing that will complete me and cast all darkness out of my life. Is this, I want that. I want that thing. That's what I've been after my whole life. I would put faith in Jesus and what he did on the cross for me and say, Jesus, I'll let you lead me and teach me how to be healthy sexually and emotionally and all that stuff. I'll do all that, and I'll turn from what I think is the best way to turn to you, God, and I'll be immersed or baptized in water to surrender my life to you, because now I understand the bill that you paid and how much you have done for me. One more thing and I'm done. 1960, there's a German Lutheran pastor in Germany named Gunther Rutenborn. And he wrote this brilliant little play called The Sign of Jonah. It's a one-act play. It says a play in 9 scenes. One act. And basically, it was written in German. It's translated to English, but produced in Germany, published in 1960 in Berlin, so all German. But it was this pastor who was struggling with what happened in his country under Hitler's regime, under the Third Reich. And he's struggling with how this happened and what happened as a German Lutheran minister. And so he's really struggling with man's inhumanity to man. And it's set, the play is in Berlin right after World War II. So it's German people really waking up from what happened in the Holocaust. And so a lot of people at that time, right after World War II, were pointing fingers at one another in Germany. And so in the play, just like in real life, the German people start asking one another, like, who is responsible for what happened? And I'm not even going to try to do justice. It is way more nuanced and cool. I'm just summarizing briefly. But it says, they're like, who is responsible for what happened? And the blame game starts. And one person blames another. One gender blames another. And it just keeps working its way up to where one guy's like, it wasn't me. Like, I'm not responsible for this. My supervisor, it's the person above me that's responsible. I needed a weekly check to take care of, feed my family. It's my supervisor. One person's like, it's the people who wield political force and political power. That's whose fault it is. One person that has political power is like, it's not my fault. Do you have any idea what it's like to lead people? And it just keeps going on up the chain until finally, to play in a certain point, everyone starts to dawn on everyone. They look at each other like, wait a minute, it's not our fault. It's the guy all the way at the top. This is God's fault that this happened. This is totally the evil and the injustice of the world. All of it's God's fault. And so all the people who just kept doing what they were doing because they needed a paycheck and they wanted to keep their families safe and they wanted to keep their shop afloat where they were a merchant or whatever, the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the people buried alive, all that stuff, it's all God's fault. And at the end of the play, they put God on trial and they deliver a verdict. They find him guilty and they deliver a verdict. They all cry, God is guilty. God is guilty for this. And the characters begin proposing a sentence for God. And one man tells the judge this, Your Honor, if this court is just, you must pronounce just sentences. If you can locate God, condemn him, as I am condemned, to become a human being, a wanderer on the earth, deprived of his rights, homeless, hungry, thirsty. Let him feel the pain, as I feel the pain of having lost his son. He shall suffer the agonies of fatherhood. And then when he at last dies, he shall be disgraced. Then perhaps in future centuries, he will govern more wisely. And you look at that and you're like, wait a minute. Like mankind looks at the injustice of the world that they caused, that we're guilty for, the stuff that we've done, and we don't want to take responsibility for it. No one wants to take the blame for the evil of mankind, and we end up shaking our fists at God and saying, it's your fault. God is guilty. God is guilty. And this is exactly what happened. The God of the gospel enters history voluntarily, and he lays down his life saying, I will take the blame and the punishment for what you've done. It's incredibly insulting, but it is the most affirming message in the world. Let's pray.